everyone, this is part 3 of our revised talk about Australian liners in the two world wars, and in this third and final part of our talk we're going to be looking at a trio of ocean liners that had similar lives and ultimately very similar and tragic fates. So let's begin. Our first two ships were almost identical. We'll be looking at the Orcades and the Strathallan. But first, let's point the camera to the Orcades. The Orcades was the new flagship of the Orient Line. It was a refinement on their earlier and revolutionary ocean liner, the Orion. The Orion was essentially to the Australian run what the Ile-de-France was to the North Atlantic. Utterly revolutionary in terms of interior fit-out, and in the case of Orient Line and the Australian service, utterly revolutionary in terms of colour scheme and external configuration. The Orcades was a follow-on from this ship. It weighed 23,456 tons, was 639 feet long, or 194 meters. And at 21 knots, it could easily keep up with the demanding schedule of running between the UK and Australia. In comparison, our second ship, which entered service only a few months afterwards, is the Strathallan. This ship was the fifth and final of P&O's Strath class liners. The first two began their service with 3 funnels, and then after the Second World War they were reduced to 1. And then the follow-on class of Straths, which were 3 ships, the Stratheden, Strathmore and the Strathallan, would have this single funnel design. Their hull shapes were also borrowed from the Orion. In terms of statistics, again, very similar. The Strathallan weighed 23,722 tons, was 668 feet long, which translates to 149 meters, and also would operate at the same service speed of 21 knots. Both ships represented the latest and greatest of what both companies had to offer. Also, in the case of Strathallan, the 5 Strats revolutionized their color schemes by bringing us these now iconic white hulls and golden yellow colored funnels, which would have made traveling on board so much more pleasant on those hot summer days and nights. Unfortunately, both liners would not survive the Second World War. In the case of the Orcades, its end came on the 10th of October 1942, when it was attacked by the U-172, and over a series of 3 aggressive attacks it managed to fire and put into the Orcades 6 torpedoes. There were 1,067 troops and crew members on board. And after the first attack, the captain decided that it would be prudent to evacuate the troops and most of the crew and retain a skeleton staff to try and keep the ship from sinking. And for a while they succeeded. They managed to keep the ship running, and in order to steer it, they would alternate power to each of the propellers. The Orcades did have rescue vessels come to it in the form of 2 destroyers. However, they were more occupied with finding, and clearly failing, to get rid of the U-172, as well as another U-boat in the area. While the destroyers were out trying and failing to prevent the U-boat from sinking the ship, another vessel, the Polish freighter Narvik, came to rescue the survivors. And in a remarkable episode, over 12 hours, the Polish crew would identify each lifeboat that had been dropped off into the sea and would pick up all the survivors. The evacuation of the Orcades had been done over a long period of time, so the lifeboats weren't all bunched together, but they were all spread out. And in addition to this, the sea conditions were getting worse. So at risk of their own safety and at the risk of simply being a sitting duck as it was picking up survivors, the crew and the captain of the Narvik would progressively over the next 12 hours pick up all the survivors from the lifeboats. By the time the U-172 had fired its sixth and final torpedo in its third attack on the Orcades, the damage was well and truly done. The ship could not survive this damage, and so the captain ordered the remaining skeleton staff to evacuate the ship. Thanks to the heroic efforts of the Narvik, almost everyone managed to survive. Those that died not due to the evacuation, but due to being within the proximity of the torpedoes and their explosions. Rightfully so, the captain of both the Narvik and the Orcades were awarded bravery medals for their actions. In the case of the Strathallan, while carrying 4,250 troops, nurses and crew members, it was struck by one torpedo on the 21st of December 1942. While initially this torpedo didn't do that much damage, what it did do was start some fires that persistently would not be put out. And so again, the captain decided it would be prudent to evacuate the massive humanity that was on board his ship, so that the crew could focus on putting out these fires that were just not being put out. And you can see up here a remarkable image of the troops climbing down and jumping onto HMAS Pathfinder, which was one of the escort ships. And this was a successful evacuation, both manually, as in over the side of the ship and onto the deck of the rescuing warship, or of course through the lifeboats. This was done in an orderly manner, and everyone managed to get off the ship. The crew did try to save the Strathallan, and they had rigged the tow line and they were bringing the ship back to Oran, and there the ship exploded. It was enveloped in a pillar of fire and flame, and sadly this was the death knell of the Strathallan. The remaining crew members quickly evacuated, the tow line was cut loose, and the burning hulk of the Strathallan rolled over and sank. Two tragic ends to two exquisite ocean liners. For our final ship, it is the Union Steamship Company of New Zealand's flagship, the Awatea. While technically not an Australian liner, I'm including it in this talk because it was extensively refitted in 1938 at Cockatoo Island in Sydney, and those extended funnels that you can see in this digital illustration were done there. It was a frequent visitor to Sydney and Australian ports, and it carried Australian troops, so for the purposes of this talk, it is being included. Also, I want to highlight its brave end as well, that does deserve wider recognition. The Awatea was New Zealand's ship of state of the late 1930s, in the same way that the Normandy, the Queen Mary, the Bremen, Europa, Rex were all their respective countries' ships of state, so too was the Awatea. Awatea is Maori for Eye of the Dawn, and this gorgeous ship represented the latest, the greatest, and the best of New Zealand at the time. It was 13,482 tons, was 527 feet long, which translates to about 160 meters, and could zip across the Tasman at 22 knots. This exquisite ocean liner should have been destined to have a long and glorious career, but with the outbreak of the Second World War, that was not the case. With most troop ships, all the luxurious accommodations were stripped out, basic bunker beds were thrown in, and temporary toilets, kitchens, and other accommodation needs were hastily installed on these ships. In the case of the Awatea, I think probably through a combination of just logistics and distance, for the first couple of years, apart from being given a grey coat of paint, the Awatea retained most of its luxurious fittings. And for the first 2 years as a troop ship, those troops had some of the most luxurious voyages that any troops had, I'm sure any one of those 16,000 troops that were embarked on the Queen Mary probably would have wanted to exchange places with any of those troops, who probably had 2 or 4 to a first-class cabin, as opposed to a dozen or 20. The end of the Awatea came on the 11th of November 1942, after unloading its troops and leaving the coast of North Africa. It was attacked by the Luftwaffe. Utilizing the ship's speed and the aggressive spirit of its anti-aircraft gunners, the Awatea put up a brave defense, trying to evade the attacking aircraft, and in the process, hitting and downing 2 of those aircraft. Unfortunately, though, the ship was overpowered. The Awatea was struck by 2 torpedoes and 1 bomb, which set the ship ablaze. The crew, unfortunately, had to evacuate the ship as the damage was just too great for them to handle. And as they were evacuating the ship, they remarked that the hull was glowing red from the intensity of the fire, and even the rivets in the hull plates were singing from the heat that was emanating from the tortured hull of this ship. And ultimately, this fine vessel would go the way of all the others and roll over and sink. Such was the dedication of the Awatea's crew to defend their ship, that the Admiral of the fleet, Admiral Harold Burrows, declared that the Awatea had fought the battle of a battleship. And it certainly was a fiery end to this proud ship, and one that deserves big screen treatment in my humble opinion. These 3 ships were the greatest of their respective shipping companies, representing the best of design, technology, and artistic brilliance. But due to the stupidity and waste of war, all 3 of them were lost.